What if I told you that one of the greatest names in the history of world poker used an almost invisible technique to take millions of dollars from casinos, without touching the cards, without cheating in the classic sense, and still was accused of fraud? Phil Ivey didn't bluff, he didn't steal, but he made the entire table sweat with something called edge sorting. Now the question that begs to be asked is, was this genius or a coup disguised as intelligence? We're talking about a player who doesn't need to raise his voice to dominate a table. His look is enough to scare you. Cold, calculating and silent. Phil Ivey doesn't play poker, he reads minds. But in this case, he went beyond poker. He entered a parallel game where whoever paid the most attention won. What you're about to discover may surprise you, because this story isn't just about cards, chips, and high stakes. It's about strategic vision, scenario reading, and the limits between legitimate advantage and cheating. Have you ever stopped to think about that? How a simple detail can be the thinnest line between being a genius or being banned. That's what happened in London at a luxury casino when Phil Ivey, accompanied by a partner with an eye as sharp as his, made over $20 million with a technique that basically consisted of observing. That's right, observing imperceptible patterns in the cards. A manufacturing defect became a lethal weapon in the hands of those who knew what they were doing. And the best or worst thing, without touching anything, without marked decks, without hidden cameras. Just observation and intelligence. But the casinos didn't like it. And when casinos lose money, they don't stay quiet. The result? An international scandal, a lawsuit, headlines in every newspaper, and a debate that never ended. Edge sorting is it cheating or not? And more, if you were in his shoes, would you do the same? Stay with me until the end, because you'll understand exactly how this technique works and why it was so controversial. We'll dive behind the scenes of one of the biggest scandals in professional poker, and you'll leave this video with a clear opinion, or maybe even more confused than before. Because when it comes to Phil Ivey, nothing is black and white. Have you ever been in a situation where you used what you knew to stand out and then were accused of cheating? Have you ever heard someone say that you only got there because you cheated? Well, yes, this video is for you, because sometimes being too good bothers you, and what bothers you becomes a threat. But before we show you how it all happened, let's take a step back. Who is Phil Ivey anyway? Where did this quiet genius who turned poker into an art form come from? And why did he become the face of a scandal that still divides opinions today? He was born in Riverside, California, but it was at the tables of Atlantic City that Phil Ivey began to build his legend, night after night, chip after chip, with a look that seemed to pierce the souls of his opponents. It wasn't long before he earned a nickname that would be just as important, the Tiger Woods of poker. And it wasn't just his talent, it was his posture, his coolness, his precision. Ivey didn't tremble, not even when the bets were huge, not even when everyone was rooting against him. But perhaps what bothered him most behind the scenes in poker and in casinos was precisely this. He didn't play like everyone else. He saw more, and when someone starts to see details that others ignore, the game changes, and it changes in a way that for many people seems unfair. Now, I want to ask you, if you were in his place, would you do the same? Would you use an almost invisible detail to your advantage, even knowing that it could turn into a scandal later? Tell me in the comments, honestly, what you think about this. Have you ever been in a situation where someone judged you for being one step ahead? Or have you ever felt bad about using a legitimate advantage that no one else noticed? This type of story generates much more than just technical discussion. It affects our perception of right and wrong and the boundaries, between ethics and strategy. So if this topic resonates with you, leave a like down here. This really helps this content reach more people who also like to dive into the finer points of poker, games, and the human mind. And of course, subscribe to the channel to continue following these stories that go beyond the deck of cards. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow. It's not just numbers, it's community. It's knowing that there are people on the other side who also see beyond the surface, who care about the game, but also about what's behind it. And speaking of behind the scenes, now that you understand who Phil Ivey is, it's time to delve into the night it all began. The million-dollar bet, the luxury casino in London, and the unusual request that lit the fuse for one of the most controversial cases in poker history. Phil Ivey is not just a poker star, he is practically an archetype. When someone mentions the complete player, the face that comes to mind for many people is his. Serene, impenetrable, almost inhuman, and that's no exaggeration. What he has done over the years surpasses any ordinary learning curve. His presence at a table changes the atmosphere. Experienced players lose their balance. Tension rises without him even moving a muscle. He doesn't yell, he doesn't rant, he doesn't try to intimidate. He just observes. And that's the most frightening thing. Over the course of his career, Ivey has won 10 WSOP bracelets, the World Series of Poker, a kind of poker Olympics. It's not just about winning. It's about winning under pressure, against the best, with cameras, fans, big money and reputation on the line. It's about mastering the mathematics of poker and at the same time understanding what the chips don't show. Expressions, hesitations, nervous tics, held breaths. And he did all this as if he were meditating. No excess, no excitement. Cold as steel. But behind this absolute control lies a story that few know. Ivey's journey was not linear. He started out in the underground games, at the most dangerous tables in Atlantic City. He would spend entire nights playing non-stop, using a fake name at the beginning of his career because he was still underage. While other players sought fame or quick money, he sought something deeper. Mastery, not just of the game, but of his own behavior. A kind of obsession with understanding the environment, reading people, predicting actions before they even happened. He treated poker as a study of human behavior. This mindset shaped not only his playing style, but also his reputation. Ivey became something of a living legend. Many treat him with reverence, as if his presence were a sign that something big is about to happen. Rivals don't hide their admiration, even when they lose to him. Some say they have never felt so much fear at a table. Others who have never learned so much in a single game. But this admiration has a curious side. It comes with a certain discomfort, because Ivey, despite being so public, is inaccessible. He doesn't talk much, doesn't like interviews, and rarely talks about himself. He plays, disappears, and comes back as if he had never left. This creates a certain mystique, as if he were more than a player, almost an entity. And perhaps that's what makes his victories so impactful. They seem inevitable. When Ivey bets, it's as if he's saying, "I already know what's going to happen, you're just finding out now." But what many didn't expect is that this silent dominance could become the center of one of the biggest controversies in poker history. Because when he applied the edge sorting, it wasn't just a technical trick. It was the exact manifestation of his essence, observing what no one sees, noticing flaws that seem invisible, and turning them into an advantage. For those who don't know this side of the game, it may seem absurd, but in high-level poker, everything is a detail. A poorly cut card, an offbeat breath, a repeated pattern, anything can turn into gold in the right hands. And that's exactly what happened in the case involving the London casino. Phil and his partner used something that many would consider irrelevant, small printing errors in the cards, to put together a near-perfect sequence of sure bets. And all of this with the casino's permission for certain eccentricities in the way they played. But then comes the uncomfortable question. If the casino accepted the terms, why did it then refuse to pay? What was really at stake? The answer may lie behind the scenes, in the quiet transformation that occurs when someone like Ivey enters the scene. Because what he does is not just play cards. It reveals hidden truths about control, perception, and mindset. When you watch him play, it seems like time slows down. The movements of his hands, the looks in his eyes, the silence, everything becomes language, and those who can read win. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because understanding the impact of edge sorting goes far beyond knowing how the technique works. The central issue lies elsewhere, in the decisions we make when we have an advantage, and in how the world reacts when someone dares to use knowledge as a weapon. Comment here. That makes sense to me. I want to know if you also see this fine line between genius and judgment. The story seemed like just another ordinary night in the luxurious and quietly hostile universe of elite casinos. Phil Ivey, already consecrated as one of the biggest names in world poker, decided to change the focus a little. Instead of the Texas Hold'em tables, he went to the Baccarat, a game less about bluffing and more about cold-blooded reading of probabilities. But here, in that room at Crockford's Casino in London, he wasn't just playing cards. He was, once again, seeing what no one else could see. It was 2012. And Ivey arrived accompanied by a woman named Chung Yin-sun. Few knew her story, but among professional players and insiders, she was already known for having a rare ability to perceive imperceptible patterns in playing cards, especially in games like Baccarat. Together, they were not just a duo. They formed a system, an almost surgical combination of concentration, silence, and technique. The proposal was simple. Play Baccarat for high stakes, but what would happen in the following hours would turn that night into a watershed in the gambling industry. The first strategic move was to request a specific deck. Ivey and her partner requested that the cards be of a particular brand, ones whose pattern on the back might feature small, symmetrical imperfections that are usually missed by the naked eye. They then requested that the dealer turn the cards in a specific way during the deal. Everything was done politely, naturally, and without raising suspicions. The employees, accustomed to the habits of millionaire gamblers, complied. But there was the beginning of what many would call silent manipulation. The request was part of the plan. Each round, the most important cards, those with high values, were rotated 180 degrees, while the less important ones were not. Ivey's partner watched very carefully and, throughout the rounds, identified millimeter-sized patterns on the edges of the cards, tiny deviations in the cut that allowed her to tell, even with the cards face down, whether they were advantageous or not. This is the edge sorting, an advanced visual reading based on manufacturing defects. It is important to emphasize that at no time was there any exchange of cards, intentional marking, or any physical violation of the deck. All they did was observe and memorize. The technique requires a trained mind, patience, and discreet communication between the players. It is as if they were reading the secret language of chance, and with it, controlling the game. During the first few rounds, the casino saw nothing out of the ordinary. After all, millionaire gamblers win and lose all the time. But when Ivey and his partner began to rack up consecutive wins, the table became a scene of silent tension. Staff whispered to each other. Supervisors approached with alert looks. By the end of the session, the total winnings were close to $7.7 million. Around $20 million at the exchange rate at the time. But the real shock was to come later. Contrary to what one would expect from a reputable casino, Crockford's refused to pay. It alleged suspicious behavior. It accused Ivey and his partner of dishonestly exploiting the game. And this raised a much deeper question. To what extent is it acceptable to use intelligence and observation to win at a game that is supposedly based on luck? The case went to court. The casino claimed that while no rules had been directly broken, the integrity of the game had been compromised. Ivey's defense was simple and straightforward. He had simply played based on the information available to him, which the casino itself had authorized by allowing the in-game requests. He hadn't cheated. He had simply played better. And this is where the argument becomes fascinating, because if the casino accepted the requests, if no one had interfered with the way the cards were arranged, and if the flaws in the deck were the fault of the manufacturer, who was really at fault? This is a question that goes far beyond poker or baccarat. It touches on something broader, how society deals with those who challenge the system. When someone finds a loophole, a flaw, a hidden logic and uses it masterfully, is that person celebrated as a visionary or punished as an opportunist? Ivey's trial was not just a legal one, it was a moral one. It was as if the casino were saying, "You beat us too cleanly, and that offends us." Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the edge sorting in itself is not what scares us. What really bothers us is what it represents. It is the symbol of a transformation, of mentality within games, the departure from pure chance to a strategic reading of the environment. Ivey personified a hidden truth that few like to admit. Luck almost always favors those who see it first. This story reveals the backstage of a world where appearance and control go hand in hand. In many ways, the casino felt betrayed because it was exposed. A system designed to deceive was defeated by someone who is not deceived by anything. This has a huge impact, not just on finances, but on credibility. Casinos are built on the idea of mathematical advantage. When someone breaks that with observation and intelligence, the structure shakes. It's not just about losing money. It's about losing power. Ivey didn't use technology. He didn't hack into systems. He didn't have privileged access. He just played carefully. And that, for many, is more dangerous than any classic cheating, because it shows that the game itself can be won within the rules, if you have enough trained eyes. Comment here. I'm on this journey too. If you also believe that intelligence and perception, when well applied, are the greatest cards someone can have in life. What Phil Ivey did at that baccarat table wasn't just playing, he was cracking a code hidden in plain sight. And this is where the most fascinating part of the story begins. The edge sorting it has nothing to do with magic, illusionism, or some kind of secret technology. It is pure clinical eye, millimetric attention, a sharp perception that transforms a detail invisible to most into an absurd strategic advantage. And yes, all of this requires more than intelligence. It requires a mentality trained to see the invisible. The deck used in the casino was not just any deck. It had a repeating design pattern on the back of the cards, but the way the cards are cut in the factory can create slight asymmetries. One side may have the design a little further from the edge than the other. It's the kind of failure that, to any ordinary person, would mean absolutely nothing. But Phil Ivey and his partner knew exactly what to look for. They turned this little factory error into a sort of compass within the game. The technique began in an almost innocent way. With each round, high cards, such as 7s, 8s and 9s, which are advantageous in baccarat, were discreetly rotated 180 degrees by the dealer at the duo's request. The casino, not understanding their real intention, complied. After all, rich players tend to have quirks and superstitions. Asking for a card to be turned over didn't seem out of the ordinary, but that was the turning point. Throughout the night, the cards began to arrange themselves in unconventional ways. High cards were turned one way, the low cards on the other, And this pattern was not on the face of the cards, but on the back, on the edges, with almost imperceptible flaws. The deck became an open book, and Ivey knew exactly what he was reading. Even before the card was revealed, he already knew, based on the edge, whether he should bet big, back off, or stay calm. It was as if he was playing with his eyes open, while the rest of the table was groping in the dark. Now think about it. Where exactly does this fall on the line between skill and cheating? He didn't mark the cards. He didn't trade anything. He didn't manipulate the outcome of the game with illegal devices or means. He just watched. He used a flaw in the system itself against the system. And what's more, with the approval of the casino, which allowed all of this to happen, without suspecting it. Is this just strategic coldness or a deliberate act of deception? This is the part where a lot of people get stuck. Because the edge sorting, it's not easy to classify. It's troubling because it reveals something about ourselves, how we judge. Success when it comes from an unexpected advantage. If it were pure luck, no one would complain. But when someone masters the gears of a game designed to favor the house and starts to turn the tables against it, it shakes up larger structures. It's not just about money. It's about control, about narrative, about who's allowed to win. The curious thing is that this technique did not come from Ivey. It was already used in isolation by some highly specialized players in games like Baccarat and the Mini Baccarat. But no one applied it with such precision and scale as he did. And that's part of his genius. He didn't invent the edge sorting, but it elevated it to a level where it stopped being a mere advantage and became a threat, because in a way, it proved that the game, any game, has cracks, and that anyone who pays enough attention can get past them. This says a lot about how we make decisions in life. What are the details that we are ignoring? At what times do we accept the rules without questioning how much they actually favor someone? Edge sorting. It's almost a metaphor for the human journey. Most people go on autopilot. But those who observe, those who stop to understand how the structure works, are the ones who can play differently, and they're not always welcome for that. Behind the scenes, many professional players were divided. Some said Ivey had crossed an ethical line, even though he hadn't broken any explicit rules. Others defended his actions tooth and nail, as if it were a strategy lesson. What was clear is that, more than a poker move, it was a test of values, because when you see a flaw and decide to exploit it, you're not just making a move, you're making a choice. A choice that carries judgment, repercussions, and sometimes condemnation. And the irony is that casinos are masters at exploiting human flaws. They use lights, sounds, a controlled environment, no windows, free drinks, all meticulously designed to push you to take risks. And then, suddenly, when a player does the opposite, uses the environment against them, the system goes on alert. Because behind the glamour lies a hidden truth. Gambling is only beautiful when the house is winning. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because understanding what happened afterwards, in the courts, behind the scenes of the trial, in the headlines that printed the words fraud, scam, cheating, reveals a clash of worlds. On one side, a mind trained like that of a great chess player. On the other, a billion-dollar industry that does not like to lose. And in the midst of all this, a question that echoes to this day. Who is right when victory exposes the error of those who never expected to lose? Write it down. That makes sense to me. If you also believe that seeing what no one else sees can change the course of any game. I didn't touch the cards. That was the phrase Phil Ivey repeated more than once when all this came to light. It wasn't just a defense, it was a turning point, because that phrase carried symbolic weight. In a world where cheating is usually associated with physical movements, hiding cards, switching decks, using devices, he knew his strategy broke that mold. He didn't cheat in the traditional way. He didn't hide anything up his sleeve. He didn't use undercover accomplices. He just paid attention. And that, in a way, made everyone even more uncomfortable. The problem, in fact, wasn't what he did. It was how he thought. The entire game was a silent dance of observation and reaction, while the staff's eyes were on the most overlooked detail of all, the asymmetry on the backs of the cards, something that technically was there for everyone to see, but in practice no one else saw. And when that happens, when someone wins by using the system's own flaw as a weapon, the structure reacts as if it had been betrayed. But it hadn't. It had simply been exposed. In court, this line was put to the test. The casino's lawyers said that Ivey had violated the spirit of the game, a vague phrase loaded with moral judgment but difficult to turn into evidence. On the other side, Ivey stood his ground. He did not cheat. He did not commit fraud. He simply noticed something that others did not and used it as a basis for his bets. What's more, everything that was done there inside that room was approved by the casino's own employees. No rules were broken. No items were manipulated. The game took place with all elements visible, in plain sight. This is where the discussion leaves the legal field and enters a much more complex area, the ethics of decisions. Because what was being judged in practice was not whether Ivey broke the rules. It was whether he had the right to use his own intellect to beat a system that, by definition, is already stacked against the player. And this discussion goes beyond poker. It touches on the essence of the competitive mentality, the way we view merit and success. When someone wins in a way that no one expected, and that apparently no one else could repeat, the first reaction is usually to be suspicious. This distrust says a lot about how society deals with those who deviate from the script. Phil Ivey didn't break the rules of the game. He questioned the logic that underpins the game, and that, for a casino, can be much more dangerous than a common fraud. Because fraud can be punished and eliminated, but intelligence can't be controlled. And when it becomes public, when people see that it's possible to beat the casino using only perception, calmness, and strategy, the myth of the house's invincibility begins to crumble. The phrase, "I didn't touch the cards," became a symbol of this rupture. It's as if he were saying, "You judge me not for what I did, but because I saw something that you yourselves missed." It's a powerful reversal, a reminder that in any system, be it a game, a market, an institution, there are always blind spots, and those who learn to identify them change the rules, even without changing them. Behind the scenes in professional poker, this story caused an earthquake. Renowned players began to debate whether this was ethics or genius. Some, more conservative, said that Ivey had taken advantage of the casino's naivety. Others were adamant. It just proved that even the most tightly controlled games have loopholes, and that the real skill lies in identifying them before someone bans them. This discussion still echoes in tables and forums to this day. Because, deep down, it touches on a dilemma that everyone has experienced at some point. Is it wrong to use something to your advantage just because no one else noticed? And if everything was done in broad daylight, what exactly differentiates a legitimate strategy from a cheat? There is no easy answer. What there is the courage to face this kind of question and to stick with it, even knowing that most people prefer a predictable winner to an uncomfortable genius. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there is an even more sensitive layer to this story, the way in which social judgment shapes our decisions and the way we interpret reality. The difference between a master and a villain, sometimes, is only in the lens of the viewer, and understanding how this perception is constructed can reveal much more about the system than about those who challenge it. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If you too have ever found yourself on the side of someone who thinks differently and been judged for it, the casinos didn't take long to react. The moment they realized the size of the loss, the mood changed. What was once champagne, smiles, and courtesy turned into silence, distrust, and closed meetings. And this is a detail that almost no one talks about. The casino only started to suspect after of losing millions. As long as he was winning, everything was accepted. The eccentricities of Phil Ivey and his partner were seen as part of the show. But when the scales turned, the game stopped being a game and became a power struggle. The day after the win, Ivey did not receive his prize. The casino claimed that it had performed an internal review before releasing the funds. Days later, the definitive denial came. The accusation was straightforward. The player had committed fraud, and the argument was curious. They were not saying that he had cheated in the classic way. They were saying that he had violated the spirit of the game. A dangerous phrase because it is vague enough to be open to any interpretation, but strong enough to tarnish reputations. The truth is that the casino panicked, because if that method were accepted as valid, other players could try to repeat it. The profit margin of the houses, built on calculated and predictable probabilities, would be challenged by something that is not in the equations: human perception. And this, for an industry that moves billions, represents a real threat. The impact would be structural. That is why the reaction was so aggressive. Phil Ivey was then dragged into a legal battle that would last years. He did not run away. He did not try to reach an agreement. He did not bow his head. He faced the process with the same coolness with which he faces a championship final table. He assembled a strong legal team, presented all the facts, and maintained a single argument. Everything was done in the open. The technique used was not illegal. The casino allowed the requests. The cards were the house cards. The deck was intact. There was no fraud, no invasion, no manipulation. What happened was observation, and that's where it gets even more interesting, because this trial is no longer just about money. It's about mindset, about how we view merit, control, the freedom to play by the rules, even if it means winning in a disconcerting way. The casino lawyers tried to paint Ivey as someone who had planned a sophisticated scam. But the very concept of scam here was shaky. His plan didn't require secrecy. It just required that no one else see it. During the trial, the revelations piled up. The casino had accepted all the terms. The dealers were instructed to turn the cards as requested. Nothing was hidden. The alleged fraud only began to exist when the loss became real. This raises a delicate question. Do the rules only apply as long as they favor one side? And when the opponent plays better within the limits of what was allowed, is it his fault? This reflection is disturbing because it reveals a hidden truth. Many systems only accept talent up to a certain point. After that, talent becomes a threat. When someone starts to win consistently, when victory stops seeming like luck and starts to be a consequence, the system reacts. First with doubt, then with resistance, and finally with punishment. It is almost a silent pattern. Merit is welcome, until the moment when it exposes the flaws of those who make the rules. Phil Ivey was at the center of this storm, a man who had always been respected by the poker community, admired for his ability to maintain emotional control, even in the most tense situations, was now seen by many as someone who had overdone it. But what does that mean anyway? Since when did playing too well become grounds for sanction? The casino's response was clear. It doesn't matter if it was legal. It was uncomfortable. They didn't just want to get their money back. They wanted to reassert their authority, to show that within the gaming universe, they still had the final say. And that's why the case went all the way to the last instance. Not because there was nothing left to debate, but because, for the bookmakers, losing to the logic of gambling edge sorting would be to lose narrative control. The court ruled against Ivey. They said that, even without breaking specific rules, he had not played in good faith. This expression became the final argument, and at the same time it became a crooked mirror, because it shows how much the perception of justice is shaped by interests. Good faith in this case was not associated with transparency, it was linked to predictability. The casino expected a predictable player, he received a strategist, and so I didn't know how to deal with it. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what was really being judged there was not just a player, it was a mindset. The courage to think differently, the audacity to turn a gap into an opportunity, and the consequences of not fitting into the comfortable model of what others call fair play. Write it down. I'm on this journey too. If you've ever felt the weight of doing everything right, and still being pointed out as doing it wrong, Phil Ivey's case didn't end in court. In fact, that was where the fight changed format, because from the moment the courts declared that he had violated the spirit of the game, a new arena opened up. That of public judgment. And this is perhaps the most ruthless of all. The poker world, which until then had revered Ivey as a kind of demigod of the felt, was divided in an almost religious way. On one side, there were those who called him a technical genius, a brilliant strategist, the personification of a sharp mind. On the other, there were those who saw in him edge sorting, a breach of ethics, a clever move with a bitter taste. And this clash exposed an uncomfortable truth. The more someone challenges the standard, the more they bother even their own. Renowned professionals began giving interviews, writing columns, discussing the case in podcasts and roundtables. Some said that if it were up to them, they would do exactly the same, that the game is about reading, observing, and taking advantage of mistakes, whether by the opponent or the structure. For them, Ivey did only what any player would do if they had the same level of perception and coolness. Others, however, used harsh words. They said he tarnished the game, that he took advantage in a way that went beyond what is considered playing well, and that even without breaking written rules, he crossed an invisible line, that of trust. This conflict has exposed an issue that goes beyond poker. It goes straight to the way we deal with unwritten boundaries. Because in every community, whether in sports, the financial market, or entrepreneurship, there are codes that are not in contracts, but that function as social compasses. And when someone challenges these codes, even without breaking any formal clause, the consequence is almost always the same: partial rejection, collective suspicion, and an uncomfortable silence in the air. Phil Ivey became this paradoxical figure, the guy who made history with impeccable technique, who never needed to resort to the emotional chaos of his opponents, who gained respect precisely by playing fair, but who was now under the scrutiny of his colleagues, as if he had betrayed an essence. But the real question that no one answered was, what essence? The game as a mental challenge, the table as a space of silent honor, or the casino as an entity that always wins in the end? Because depending on which spirit you choose to follow, the judgment changes completely. That's why so many people see themselves reflected in this story, because everyone has experienced, at some level, this kind of subjective judgment. That feeling of being within the rules, but being treated as someone who crossed the line, as if the problem wasn't what you did, but the fact that you did it so precisely that it destabilized the logic of others. And that hurts more than any defeat, because it's not a real mistake. It's a reaction to your success. For Ivey, this noise never turned into a shout. He maintained the same posture as always. He spoke little, avoided controversy, and kept his presence behind the scenes, as if he knew that time reveals more than the headlines. But the symbolic damage was done. he began to be mentioned with an asterisk, as a name that divides opinions, a genius for some, a transgressor for others. And deep down, perhaps this says more about others than it does about him, because the discomfort with genius is old. When someone breaks patterns so cleanly, so intelligently, and so efficiently, the system creates ways to delegitimize it. It calls it luck, a coup, a shortcut, but it almost never recognizes what it really is, a silent transformation in the way of thinking. And this is true for poker, but also for any other field where merit scares more than it inspires. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this conflict between ethics and skill is not exclusive to gaming. It appears whenever someone decides to play a game that others didn't even know existed. And the way we deal with these issues reveals a lot about our relationship with risk, success, and our own limits. Comment here. That makes sense to me if you have ever experienced this dilemma between being recognized for thinking outside the box or being judged for not staying inside it. Phil Ivey's case was not the first, and certainly will not be the last, to challenge the boundaries between strategy and cheating. He just made more visible something that has always existed behind the scenes in the gaming world, the art of using technical knowledge to win where everyone swears that chance reigns. Because when it comes to casinos, the glamour hides an obvious truth. Everything there is designed so that the house wins. And the moment someone figures out a way to turn that equation around without breaking any written rules, the game really changes. Throughout history, many gamblers have broken these invisible lines. One of the most emblematic cases is that of Don Johnson, not the actor, but the American gambler who in 2011 won more than $15 million from 3 Atlantic City casinos playing blackjack. He did it without cheating, without resorting to trickery, without hiding his cards. What he did was simple and brilliant. He negotiated extremely advantageous rules before starting to play. He demanded conditions that, combined with his mathematical skills and emotional control, broke the house edge, and the casinos accepted him. Why? Because he was a high-level gambler with a history of big losses, and they thought the game was still under control. But he wasn't. Johnson played coolly, calculatedly, without letting emotion get in the way. He knew when to stop, when to bet, when to change tables. He used the very structure of the casinos against them. And by the time they started to realize it, it was too late. He had the money, the chips had been counted, and no rules had been broken. But still, the questions arose. Was it fair? Had he cheated the spirit of the game? Was he too clever? Another example that sends shivers down the spines of casino owners is the case of the Pelayo brothers in Spain in the 1990s. They discovered that some roulette wheels had tiny physical imperfections that caused certain numbers to come up more frequently. They analyzed thousands of spins, recorded results for months, and created algorithms, all before they even placed a single chip. When they started playing, they knew exactly what they were getting into, and they won, consistently, thousands of euros. And again, without touching the equipment, without manipulating anything, without hacking into systems, they just watched, they just studied. The pattern begins to repeat itself. People who win not because they cheat, but because they take the time to understand the hidden truth behind the game. People who see what others don't have the patience to see. And then the inevitable question arises. At what point does knowledge stop being an advantage and become a crime? This line is nebulous because it is not written anywhere. And that is why every time someone crosses this invisible line, the debate returns with force. Where does genius end and accusation begin? Who defines this boundary? The law, public opinion, or the owners of the system who only accept victory as long as it stays within the script? In practice, what these cases show is that the biggest threat to casinos and to systems in general is not classic cheating. It is applied intelligence. It is the player who understands more than he should, who looks beyond the surface, who refuses to believe that everything is predefined. These are the ones who cause discomfort because they don't just challenge the game, they challenge the mindset behind it. And perhaps that is where the real key to this discussion lies. The discomfort that arises in these cases comes from the breakdown of the narrative of control. When a player shows that the casino, or any dominant system, has structural flaws, he is not just making money, he is exposing the fragility of authority, and that bothers more than any financial loss. That's why so many of these players, even without breaking any laws, end up being banned, frowned upon, or pushed to the margins, not because they stole, but because they proved that the supposed neutrality of the system is an illusion, that there is, in fact, a loophole, and that it can be used by anyone willing to see it. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this discussion about the limit between legitimate advantage and cheating touches directly on a silent wound, the way we see success that comes from detail, study, and observation. The world is not always ready to deal with those who refuse to play blindfolded. Write it down. I'm on this journey too. If you believe that knowing more and using it to your advantage should never be a crime. When the final verdict came down, many people thought it would mark the end of the legend, that losing the lawsuit against the casino was the same as a moral condemnation. After all, the court had declared that Phil Ivey had violated the spirit of the game, that ambiguous expression that carries more subjective judgment than any technical argument. But the real question was not whether he lost in court. The question was, did he lose the respect of the community? Did he lose the title of genius that he had built up over decades? The answer, like most things in this story, is not simple, but it reveals a lot about the power of perception, reputation, and the way we deal with those who break the rules without breaking them. Ivey continued to be Ivey, discreet, with the same restrained posture as always, without big statements, without trying to justify anything. He didn't try to clean up his image because, deep down, he knew it was never really dirty. The legal trial is one chapter, but the community, the public, and history's trial happens at a different pace. And that's exactly what started to happen in the months and years that followed. While some still repeated the arguments that he overreacted, a growing part of the poker community began to see that episode in a different light, not as a scandal, but as proof of the cold and precise genius that he always carried. Behind the scenes at tournaments, at the high stakes, tables and on the forums, the opinion was growing. Phil Ivey didn't cheat, he went further. He did what no one else had the courage to do. He showed that even a seemingly perfect game has flaws, and that, deep down, is what every professional player seeks, to see where no one else is looking. But the most curious thing was to observe how the verdict itself became a point of division. Many began to question the concept of spirit of the game used by the court. What exactly does it mean to play in good faith? Is it following the rules? Or is it behaving in a way that is comfortable for the system? Because if the casino accepted all the conditions, if the employees carried out every step requested, and if there was no external manipulation, how can it be said that there was bad intention? This impasse has revealed a truth that goes far beyond gambling. The world tends to punish winners in ways it has yet to understand. It's as if there is an invisible barrier between the acceptable and the disconcerting. And Ivey crossed this barrier so naturally that the system only knew how to react in the way it knows how, trying to discredit him. But it didn't work. His reputation, though marred by this controversy, was not destroyed. On the contrary, for many, it was enhanced. Because now he was not just the guy with 10 WSOP bracelets. He was not just the man feared at the tables. He was the symbol of a mentality, the living representation that the game, any game, can be won with observation, patience, and a dose of daring. That there is no unshakable system, that there is always a loophole, and that whoever finds it should not be called a villain, but a visionary. This shift in perception also raised an important discussion. Why is discomfort with smart victory still so common? The answer lies in the way we were taught to deal with merit. We were taught that success comes with sweat, visible effort, pain. But when someone wins through reasoning, silent strategy, invisible reading of the scenario, it bothers us because it escapes our mental model of fair work. It seems like cheating, but it isn't. It seems like a shortcut, but it's study. And the brain rejects what it can't clearly label. That's why Ivey remains a huge name in poker, because he represents this rupture. He is proof that you can do everything right, within the rules, and still be condemned. Not for what you did, but for what you revealed. And that's a lesson that goes beyond any casino table. In any area of life, when someone has the courage to see what is hidden, to act coolly in the face of chaos, and to challenge structures that seemed absolute, the price to pay is almost always the same: distrust, judgment, and sometimes exclusion. But the legacy that remains is also the same: transformation, impact, inspiration. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because Ivey's story isn't just about games. It's about how we deal with the discomfort of watching someone play at another level. It's about the revelations that come when victory doesn't fit the traditional mold, and about how true genius is rarely immediately understood. Comment here. That makes sense to me. If you also believe that not all truth fits into common judgments, and that sometimes what appears to be an error is just a vision that arrived before its time. Phil Ivey didn't get on stage. He didn't ask for applause. He did not release an autobiography justifying himself. He just followed in silence, as he always did. And deep down, this silence says more than any argument. Because when someone is condemned, not for breaking the rules, but for seeing better than the rest, what is on trial is not the action, it is the vision, the ability to observe, to connect dots that no one else is seeing, to find flaws where everyone swears everything is perfect. This, in any system, is seen as a threat, especially when the system feeds on the illusion that it is unbreakable. Phil Ivey was punished for seeing what no one else saw. And perhaps this is the most honest summary of this story. It wasn't a hidden letter. It wasn't a cheap trick. It was a precise, almost clinical perception that the game that everyone thinks is impenetrable does in fact have cracks, that the house edge is not absolute, and all it takes is a trained eye, a calm mind, and a silent strategy to make the castle shake. What bothered me most was not his victory. It was the way it exposed the fragility of the system. Ivey didn't take on the casino with force. He won with intelligence. And that's what's most frightening, because it's uncontrollable. You can't stop someone from thinking. You can't banish the watchful eye. And when victory comes from that source, the system doesn't know how to react. There's no manual for it. So what they do is attack what they can't predict, and they label as cheating what, deep down, is just genius outside the script. This case forces us to rethink a lot of things. To what extent does society accept people who play differently? Where is the real line between strategy and fraud? Because if everything was done clearly, with the approval of those involved, based on the structure that already existed, why was the reaction so harsh? Maybe because what was at stake was not just money. It was control. And Phil Ivey, at that moment, showed that control was in his hands. There is something very symbolic about this silence after the trial. While the world was arguing, judging, and choosing sides, he kept playing. Maybe because he knows that true masters don't try to convince anyone, they just show. And what Ivey showed is too uncomfortable to be accepted without resistance. He showed that the correct reading of a situation, no matter how discreet, can change the entire outcome. That sometimes the secret is not in playing harder, but in realizing where the game is vulnerable. And that goes for everything in life. The fees. Trial, in this case, was never just about a game. It was about a specific type of person. One who isn't satisfied with following the rules, but who understands the logic behind them, who sees the truth hidden between the lines, who sees the rack while others are still stuck to the show. People like that are annoying, because he doesn't accept easy explanations, because you're not content to play like everyone else, and because when he wins, he exposes a collective discomfort that no one likes to face head-on, that perhaps the system is wrong and not the player. Phil Ivey has become one of those mirrors, a reflection of what happens when merit ceases to be palatable, when victory slips from the acceptable mold, and when success begins to seem too dangerous to tolerate. His story is less about cards and more about courage. The courage to think differently, the courage to act with conviction, the courage to not back down when the whole world tries to push you back into the box where everyone else feels safe. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the question that remains is no longer whether he did right or wrong. The question that remains is, if you were in his place, with the same vision, the same reading, the same opportunity, would you have played the same way? Comment. Here, I would have played the same if you also believe that thinking better shouldn't be a crime, and that seeing before others is, in fact, a legitimate way to win. If you've made it this far, you probably felt that this content touched something deep inside you, whether it was a question, a memory, or even a new way of seeing the game and life. And that's exactly why this channel exists, to provoke this kind of reflection, to bring real stories that go beyond what appears on the surface. If this conversation made sense to you, if at some point this narrative caught your attention, made you think differently, or simply made you want to keep listening, then it's worth subscribing to the channel, because that's what you'll find here. In-depth content without beating around the bush, with stories that speak directly. Leave a comment here with, "I'm with you until the end," just so I know. You stayed until the last second. It's the kind of thing that makes a difference, because it shows that there are people on the other side who really connect with this kind of conversation. And if this video touched you in some way, that like is also welcome. More than a number, it shows that this type of content has space, has value, and deserves to continue existing. And hey, there's a video here that complements this subject. Click and continue with me there. The story just gets better.